Welcome to the J-Spot, the place where we stimulate the most sensitive parts of your brain.
You know, I gotta say, every time you use that intro, it catches me slightly off guard.
Well, that is the entire point. It keeps you on your toes. And honestly, looking at the calendar today, being Wednesday, February 25, 2026, I think all of you listening probably need a bit of a jolt to process the world right now.
Oh, absolutely. The news cycle has just been, it's relentless.
Relentless is the word.
Yeah.
And if you've glanced at a screen any time in the last couple of years, you've probably noticed that we are sitting right at this incredibly loud, incredibly messy intersection of religion and modern conservative politics.
Right. It's pretty much the headline of the decade at this point.
Exactly. And I think for a lot of people tuning in, the feeling isn't just political exhaustion. It is genuine confusion. You have these massive political figures campaigning so heavily on Christianity and family values, they shout it from the rooftops. But then you look at the actual policies, the fine print, and it seems to actively dismantle the support systems for the very families they claim to champion.
It's a massive disconnect.
It really is. It feels like a glitch in the matrix. You hear pro-family, but then you see cuts to economic safety nets or a tax on IVF or a flat refusal to fund childcare. So that is our mission for today's deep dive. We are going to dissect the machinery of this political movement. What are we actually looking at here?
And to do that objectively, we really have to dig into the data and the legal frameworks. We're going to analyze what sociologists call the God gap in voting. So who is actually in the pews versus who is voting for these policies? We're going to tackle the rise of Christian nationalism and also look at the very valid pushback to that label.
Right, because there are multiple sides to that debate.
Exactly. We have to be fair. And finally, we are going to unpack a legal strategy called private regulation, which is honestly reshaping American life completely under the radar.
And just to set the table for everyone listening, we are not just pulling hot takes off of social media today. We have a really robust stack of source material we're working from.
We do. We're looking at hard voting data from Pew Research spanning 2024 to 2025. We have a really dense but fascinating legal analysis from the Santa Clara Law Review. And to ensure we aren't just in an echo chamber, we're pulling from a Liberty University dissertation that defends conservative political theology, contrasting that with a theological thesis on the biblical response to Christian nationalism, plus some reporting and analysis from a few other organizational dip dives.
Okay, so let's jump right in. I want to start with the vocabulary because terms just get thrown around like confetti right now. Christian nationalism. Depending on what channel you're watching, it is either the absolute salvation of Western civilization or it's the end of democracy.
Yeah, the rhetoric is dialed up to 11.
So what is it really? Is it just a fancy academic way of describing a Christian who happens to vote?
That right there is the million-dollar friction point. And we really have to be precise because definitions matter here. If we look at the theological thesis and the organizational resources we reviewed, they define Christian nationalism as something completely distinct from Christianity itself.
Distinct how? Like a different denomination?
Deeper than that. They argue it's a difference in nature. They describe it not as a religion of grace or redemption, but as a political ideology. It's framed as a reaction to secularization. The argument is that where traditional Christianity is about the kingdom of God, Christian nationalism is squarely about the kingdom of this world.
Okay.
It effectively replaces the biblical categories of sin and salvation with strict political categories of us versus them, good versus evil.
So it reframes basic civic politics as a literal holy war.
Essentially, yes. It takes the absolute cosmic concept of good versus evil and applies it to things like tax policy or school board elections or library funding. The sources note that this ideology co-opts Christian symbols, the cross, the flag, prayer circles, and weaponizes them purely for political power.
I've definitely seen this in the rhetoric. We had that quote in our notes from Pastor Greg Locke, which was pretty jarring.
Yes, calling Democrats God-denying demons. Or you can look at the language politicians like Ron DeSantis have used, telling crowds to put on the full armor of God to fight the left.
Right, which is wild because that is not saying we disagree on the municipal budget. That is saying you are an existential threat to my soul.
And that is the crucial takeaway from the theological analysis we read. When you frame your political opponent as a demon, compromise becomes a sin. You don't negotiate with demons, right? You destroy them. It shifts the entire goal of politics from governance, which inherently requires compromise, to total conquest. Our sources point to the Seven Mountain Mandate as the blueprint for this.
The Seven Mountain Mandate. It sounds like the title of a fantasy novel.
It really does, but it's a very serious theological framework for a specific subset of voters. It's the idea that Christians are mandated by God to take dominion over 7 specific areas of society.
Which are?
Government, media, education, business, arts and entertainment, family and religion. It's not about having a seat at the table. It's about owning the table. Dominance.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here, or maybe angel's advocate given the topic. We have the Liberty University dissertation in our stack, and they push back pretty hard on this whole narrative, don't they?
They do, and this is vital for a fair assessment. We cannot just ignore their perspective. The dissertation argues that the term Christian nationalism has actually been weaponized by left-leaning sociologists as a pejorative label.
So basically they're saying it's a slur to shut conservatives up.
Exactly. Their argument is that standard historical conservative views, like being pro-life or believing in traditional marriage or just wanting prayer in schools, are being rebranded as nationalism to make them sound dangerous. Or fascist.
Oh, I see.
They suggest that researchers are interpreting standard Christian language about blessing the nation and assuming it has some nefarious, hidden authoritarian meaning.
So from their perspective, they are just engaging in valid Christian political participation, and the media is slapping this scary label on them to delegitimize their vote.
Precisely. It represents a massive tug-of-war over reality itself. One side sees a dangerous heresy that threatens democracy. The other side sees a secular attack on their fundamental right to bring their faith into the public square. And we're not here to say who is right, but just to show you the massive gulf between how these two groups view the exact same actions.
It is a messy battlefield, but let's actually look at the soldiers on the field. Who are these people? Because I think the lazy assumption for a lot of us is if you are a Christian nationalist or a hard-right religious voter, you must be a super devout churchgoer. You know, front row, Bible open, never miss a Sunday service.
And that assumption would be entirely wrong. This is where the data from Pew Research is absolutely fascinating. It reveals what sociologists call the God gap, but it plays out in a way you really might not expect.
Okay, break that down for us. What does the data actually show?
So on the surface, if you just look at the aggregate numbers, the stereotype kind of holds up. Frequent churchgoers generally vote Republican. In the 2024 and 2025 data sets, about 62% of monthly attenders align with the GOP.
So more church equals more Republican.
Only if you completely ignore race. And you cannot ignore race in American sociology. When you look at Black Protestants, they have some of the highest church attendance rates in the entire country. They are incredibly devout, very biblically literal in many ways, yet they vote overwhelmingly Democratic. 76% of Black voters are Christian compared to 42% of white Democrats.
So high religious commitment does not automatically equal conservative voting.
It does not. The religious right is effectively a white religious right phenomenon. But here's the real twist, and this is something both the sociological reporting and the Liberty University source touch on. We are seeing the rise of the unchurched nationalist.
The unchurched nationalist. That sounds like an oxymoron, like a carnivorous vegan.
It totally does, but it makes perfect sense if you view Christianity not as a theology, but as a heritage, like a cultural tribe. The research suggests there is a rapidly growing segment of the right wing that identifies with Christian nationalism purely as an ethnic or cultural identity. White Christian nationalism. They believe in Western civilization, they champion the Judeo-Christian heritage, but they don't necessarily go to church or believe in the Sermon on the Mount.
So they want the Christian nation, but they don't necessarily want the Christian God telling them to love their enemies or turn the other cheek.
Bingo. The Liberty University dissertation actually notes this distinction with a really fascinating observation. It points out that these secular Christian nationalists are often more willing to die for their country than for their faith.
Wow.
And the theological critique points out the danger here. The God of this specific movement often lacks the Bible's central virtues like love, grace, humility, and focuses entirely on judgment, power, and control.
That honestly explains why the political rhetoric can get so nasty.
Yeah.
If you strip the religion of the grace and the charity parts, and you just keep the tribal identity and the symbols, you just have a really aggressive political club.
Exactly. And the organizational reporting warns that this dynamic turns churches into echo chambers of partisan sorting. Pew actually backs this up with hard numbers. Republicans are far less religiously diverse than Democrats. Religiousness varies a lot by race among Democrats, but relatively little among Republicans. It is becoming a very strict cultural monolith.
Okay, so we have the definitions and we have the actual voters, some of whom aren't even religious in the traditional sense, which is wild. But now I want to pivot to the policy impact. Because if the rhetoric is all about family values, you would expect the policy outcomes to be, well, good for families. But the sources we reviewed suggest there's a massive disconnect there.
It is a significant paradox. And to understand how it operates, we have to look at the legal strategy being employed. This is where that Santa Clara Law Review article becomes critical. The author introduces a concept called private regulation.
Private regulation. It sounds like something strictly financial. Is that just deregulation?
It is actually much more clever than that, and perhaps more insidious depending on your view. Historically, if conservative lawmakers wanted to ban something, say abortion or certain books, they would pass a state or federal law banning it.
Right, standard politics.
But direct laws can be struck down by federal courts, or they can cost you an election because they're unpopular. Private regulation is a shift in strategy. Instead of the government banning things directly, the government creates religious exemptions or civil mechanisms that allow private actors to restrict the rights of others.
Can you give me a concrete example? I need to wrap my head around this.
The classic example is the Hobby Lobby Supreme Court decision. That ruling allowed a private employer to deny contraception coverage to employees based on the owner's religious beliefs. The government didn't ban contraception, they just allowed your boss to effectively ban it for you within your health plan.
Ah, I remember that. So it shifts the power from the state directly to the corporation or the individual.
Exactly. And the 303 Creative case did the exact same thing for businesses refusing service for same-sex weddings. The legal analysis argues this effectively outsources the regulation of morality, but it goes a huge step further with vigilante enforcement.
Vigilante is a really strong word. Are we talking about the Texas abortion law?
Yes, SB 8. Think about how that law actually worked mechanically. State officials didn't enforce the ban. Instead, the law deputized private citizens to sue anyone who aided or abetted an abortion. It literally created a bounty system.
Neighbor reporting neighbor for a $10,000 payout.
Correct. And the legal review warns that this model is now being proposed for other issues. Imagine a law where you can sue your local public library for stocking a book that mentions LGBTQ characters, or sue a public school teacher for mentioning systemic racism.
It is genius in a very dark way. The state can just wash its hands and say, hey, we aren't censoring books. These concerned citizens are just filing private civil lawsuits.
Exactly. It maintains a veneer of legitimacy. It allows for the nullification of constitutional rights without ever formally overturning them. You just make exercising that right so legally risky and so financially ruinous that people simply give up.
And this brings us right to the family values paradox I mentioned in the intro, specifically IVF. We saw this in the legal review and the policy reporting.
The Alabama LePage decision. This was a massive turning point for the country. The state court decided that frozen embryos are extrauterine children, and they based this explicitly on theological views.
Which practically shut down IVF clinics in the state overnight because the liability was just too high. I mean, if you drop a petri dish, are you facing a manslaughter charge?
Exactly. And here is the bitter irony that our sources point out. You have a movement that claims to be fiercely pro-family and is obsessed with birth rates. They are terrified of the declining population. Yet their theological commitment to embryonic personhood nearly destroyed the one medical technology that helps people who desperately want to be parents actually have children.
It's like the theology collided with the actual reality of family building, and the theology won, even if it actively hurt families in the process.
It did. And the economic reporting we looked at is very critical here. It argues that these political factions talk endlessly about parental responsibility, but they consistently vote against the economic safety nets that make raising a family possible.
Right. Things like the child tax credit, affordable childcare, paid family leave. We see these voted down time and time again by the very same people preaching about the sanctity of the nuclear family.
The reporting mentions initiatives like Project 2025 and figures like J.D. Vance in this context. The focus tends to be on restricting birth control or publicly shaming childless women, rather than providing structural economic support. It prioritizes moral policing over economic enablement.
The message basically feels like, we demand that you have a traditional family, but we are going to make it incredibly expensive, legally risky, and medically difficult for you to do so.
Which leads right back to that definition of Christian nationalism we discussed at the very beginning. The goal isn't necessarily human flourishing in a broad, inclusive sense. The goal is enforcing a specific moral hierarchy.
So let's zoom out for a second. We have covered the definitions, the voters, and the laws. What is the actual structural threat here? Is this just politics as usual, the pendulum swinging back and forth, or is something fundamentally breaking?
Well, the legal analysis argues that this strategy of private regulation is a direct threat to the rule of law itself. When you outsource enforcement to vigilantes or private employers, you lose the equal protection of the law. Your civil rights suddenly depend entirely on who your boss is or what state you live in or who your neighbor happens to be.
It creates a patchwork country.
It does. But there is also a profound threat to the church itself. And I think for you listeners who are people of faith, this is the part that really stings.
Because you would think this kind of immense political power would be framed as a win for the church. We are finally winning the culture war.
Right. Not according to the theological critique. That thesis argues that Christian nationalism is Christianity completely void of the gospel.
Void of the gospel. That is a damning accusation from inside the house.
It really is. But they say, look at the fruit of the movement. It becomes legalistic and entirely power-focused. It trades the biblical command to love your neighbor for a political mandate to control your neighbor. The reporting warns that churches lose their prophetic voice entirely. When poverty is viewed solely as a moral failing of the poor rather than a systemic injustice, Christian care for the vulnerable evaporates. The church just becomes a political action committee that happens to have better music on Sundays.
And we really cannot ignore the physical danger here. We talked a lot about rhetoric, but that rhetoric moves actual bodies. The organizational report we read was pretty explicit about the connection to January 6th.
They were. They rigorously documented the presence of Christian nationalist symbols, wooden crosses, an appeal to heaven flags, group prayer circles, right there in the middle of the violence. The theological source also mentions the Jericho March reenactments leading up to the insurrection.
Wait, reenacting the biblical Battle of Jericho? Physically blowing trumpets and marching?
Yes. Marching around state and federal government buildings, praying for the walls of the quote-unquote corrupt election to fall. It is incredibly powerful imagery, but it frames the democratic process as a literal spiritual war. And if the other side is demonic, violence isn't just an option, it becomes a righteous duty. That is how you get regular people attacking the Capitol, fully believing they are doing God's work.
That is heavy. But it explains why you can't just debate these issues over a cup of coffee anymore. For one side, it is a disagreement over tax brackets or zoning laws. For the other side, it is Armageddon.
Exactly. The stakes have been raised to a supernatural level.
All right, let's bring this deep dive in for a landing. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. If we had to distill the main takeaway for our listeners here, what is it?
I think it's that we are witnessing a massive merger. A merger of a very specific religious identity, often a secular, unchurched identity, with hard political power.
And this merger is utilizing novel, highly sophisticated legal strategies like private regulation and bounty systems to bypass the usual democratic checks and balances.
Correct. And in doing so, it frequently acts against the traditional teachings of the faith like charity and grace, and acts actively against the economic interests of the actual everyday families it claims to be saving.
It is a movement that demands you have a family, but cuts the support you need to feed them. It demands you respect life, but threatens the medical technology that creates it.
That is the core paradox we've been circling this whole time.
It certainly leaves us with a lot to chew on.
It does. And if I can leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own.
I love a provocative thought to end the show. Go for it.
We have seen today that Christian nationalism is increasingly becoming a secular cultural identity for people who don't actually attend church. And we have also seen that the legal system is increasingly outsourcing the enforcement of morality to private religious actors. So the question you have to ask yourself is, are we moving toward a theocracy run by people who don't actually believe in the theology they are enforcing?
A theocracy without God. That is a thought that is definitely going to keep me up tonight.
It raises the ultimate question for this era. Who is actually in charge here, the faith or the power?
Indeed. Well, that is all the time we have for this deep dive. The J-Spot is a Jay Briar Allen production, edited by Jay Rivera, Danielle Reyes, and Josette Garcia. Keep your brain stimulated, and we'll catch you next time.